The Paris Olympics have come and gone, but the running shoe that dons the Paris name is still available for purchase. Meet the Asics Metaspeed Sky Paris. What's up everyone, I'm Eric McIntyre, aka Rad Dad Bod, and you're watching Rad Dad Bod TV, where we review running shoes. Today we're talking about the Asics Metaspeed Sky Paris. Now, if this is your first time watching one of my videos, you may notice some timestamps in the description below. Feel free to hop around to any part of the review and get what information you need, but if you do so, I would sure appreciate if you came back and watched the full video, as I put a lot of time and effort into making these as comprehensive and educational as possible. Before we get into the intended use of the shoe, let's talk about some disclaimers and disclosures. I received this shoe as a gift from one of my running clients, but not from Asics or any other running associated brand or store. And no one gets to see the video beforehand. All thoughts are entirely my own. With that out of the way, let's talk about the intended use of the shoe. This is Asics' premier super shoe or carbon-plated racing option for the marathon. As such, that's how we're going to be evaluating the shoe throughout the review. The shoe $250, which is honestly kind of a mid-tier price point for super shoes nowadays. So it's not what I would consider expensive, but it's not what I would consider cheap either. It's just about average. From a spec standpoint, the heel comes in at 39.5 millimeters and the forefoot is 34.5 for a 5 millimeter heel to toe drop. And in a men's size 9, this shoe comes in at a super lightweight 6.4 ounces, which I believe makes it the second lightest super shoe, second only to the Evo 1 from Adidas. Moving on to the fit of the shoe, I found that the heel was a pretty standard heel. Then you get a narrow midfoot and a wide overall toe box. From a length standpoint, I do feel like it fits true to size, so whatever your normal running shoe size is in Asics or other brands, I would continue with that size. I wear a 10.5, this is a 10.5. Moving on to the upper, Asics uses what's called a Motion Wrap 2.0 material, which is a mesh-like material with kind of these little plastic fibers that run through the shoe, and then you have kind of this weave that comes through the remainder of the upper, creating a very, very lightweight and very, very breathable experience. The tongue is not gusseted and is just a light piece of fabric, which sometimes with that kind of really thin tongue, you get some lace bite, but I didn't feel like that was the case with this shoe. The other thing that kind of lacks with a non-gusseted tongue is sometimes you can't get as good of lockdown in the midfoot, and I will say that this upper as a whole did have me shifting a little bit in the shoe, though I didn't necessarily feel like that was because of the midfoot so much as the heel and the actual toe box itself. Even using a runner's knot at times, I felt like the lockdown in the shoe wasn't my favorite, and that was one thing that kind of held this shoe back for me a little bit, because if I'm going to be running, 26.2 miles, or if I'm going to be running fast, I do want to be locked down in the shoe and not have to worry about potential chafing or rubbing or hot spots due to shifting in the shoe. Depending on how you like your shoes to fit though, there is plenty of room in that toe box for your toes to splay, and the upper is super lightweight and super breathable, so I didn't find that the upper itself was rubbing, and I didn't actually experience any hot spots. I'm just saying with shifting there is potential for that, especially over a 3+, 4+ hour race for most people. The upper does have some nice cushion in the heel, and they're really strategic about where they're adding weight, and so really there's a reason why this shoe is so light, and I do appreciate that, because the same way that kind of friction or hot spots can add up over time, so can the weight in a shoe when you're covering the marathon distance. Moving on to the midsole, Asics uses the Flight Foam Turbo Plus PEBA-based midsole with a carbon fiber plate running through the shoe. This creates a very, very responsive ride underfoot, and I would classify this shoe as one of the snappier types of super shoes, as opposed to like a heavily cushioned or really, really soft underfoot feeling. In fact, when thinking about other super shoes, I do believe that this is probably one of, if not the firmest underfoot feel. And at times, as you fatigue, if your form kind of isn't really locked in, then the shoe can feel kind of slappy. I do think this is accentuated by the fact that the outsole or the midsole itself, the foam or just profile of the shoe, is almost spoon shaped. So you can see that it's very narrow here in the heel, and then it widens out here in the forefoot. And so again, if you're a heel striker, you're probably going to get a little bit of that slap sensation. But if you are more on your midfoot and forefoot, you're going to get some really good propulsion, some really, really good snap. The carbon fiber plate, as you can see, is very, very stiff. It's not going to flex too much. And so again, a little bit firmer overall experience underfoot. Now, you may think that that would prevent you from being able to take the shoe kind of on a variety of paces, and yes, admittedly, it does feel most comfortable at marathon plus paces, especially kind of in that threshold tempo zone or on short intervals. That being said, I did take it out on a 20-mile kind of somewhat easy run, and they did feel comfortable throughout, and despite it feeling firm underfoot, I didn't get any discomfort or foot pain or fatigue because of that. One thing to note though is because of kind of that narrow shape of the foam underfoot, especially there in the heel or even kind of back end of the midfoot, the is fairly unstable even when compared to other Supershoe competitors. The outsole of the shoe uses the Asics grip rubber, as you can see there, and it's touted as a really durable rubber. One thing I do want to point out though is having under 50 miles in the shoe, I actually do have a decent amount of kind of that traction pattern already worn down, especially there kind of in the back heel. It's noticeable enough that I do see kind of a slight difference in the thickness of that rubber back there, and so I would imagine it's the same in the forefoot. So I would wonder if these would really kind of wear through, you know, even a couple hundred miles if we'd start to see kind of that rubber disappear in the back and start to eat away at the foam. As far as traction though, it got the job done, and I do appreciate kind of the minimal rubber and the strategically placed rubber overall on the outsole, because typically when brands really do a robust rubber on a super shoe, that's where a lot of the excess weight ends up coming from. As far as who's this shoe for, I would say that this is more of a veteran or experienced runner super shoe. The reason why I say that is one, kind of the stability challenges of the shoe. Even as someone who doesn't run in stability shoes, I felt like it was fairly noticeable enough that I did want to bring it up in the review to where I was shifting a little bit in the shoe and would like a little bit more support or maybe a little wider base. The other reason why it's probably a little bit more of a veteran super shoe is just because the foam is significantly firmer than a lot of the other super shoes on the market, and that's just not where a lot of beginners tend to gravitate towards. Now, if it is your preference, if you do like something that is a little bit firmer, something that gives you at least the feeling of some ground feel, then certainly that's going to be the case. But most runners that I talk to, especially newer runners, are looking for something that it's gonna save their legs over a marathon distance, and I don't believe that these will do that for you. So for that reason, I would say that this is more, again, of an advanced runner super shoe. Again, that being said, anyone with this preference can wear the shoe and enjoy it. It's not like you have to run a certain pace to be able to get any benefit or enjoyment out of this shoe. The number one thing is comfort. Other people who might enjoy this shoe, despite the midfoot being fairly narrow, are people who really like to have a little bit more room in the toe box. There really aren't many wide-footed options for runners out there in the super shoe category, and normally when I'm talking to people who need wide feet, they're really talking about allowing their toes to breathe, because this is not going to be a good viable option if you need more room in the midfoot. But if you do want a toe box that is accommodating, I do find this to be one of the more accommodating toe boxes out there. And so if you want a somewhat wider fitting overall super shoe, this could be a really good option for you. Now, I'm not going to speak to the differences between the Sky and the Edge because I only ran in the Sky and I can only speak about how I felt about the Sky itself. But there are a lot of great reviewers out there who got both and were able to do reviews on both or even comparisons of the two. If I'm being completely honest, it's still a little bit confusing to me how Asics kind of decides who should fit which shoe. I will say that I very much enjoyed the Metaspeed Sky Paris, maybe not as a marathon racing shoe, but it was a shoe that I felt comfortable in, and I could take on long runs, and I did take on long runs, and so I would feel confident still with the shoe on my feet that I could finish a marathon. I just don't know if it would be my number one choice. But if I'm thinking of my super shoe rankings for the year, I do believe that the Metaspeed Sky Paris would probably be my number 3, my number 2 being the Endorphin Pro 4, and my number 1 being the Adidas Adizero Adios Pro Evo 1. Now, from a comparison standpoint, the Metaspeed Sky Paris is a fairly unique offering in the super shoe category. I don't feel like it feels quite as aggressive as the Alpha Fly, though it is probably closest to the Alpha Fly in terms of underfoot feel, with it being a little bit punchy but snappy kind of there in the forefoot. It actually probably fits somewhere, now that I'm thinking about this, it probably fits somewhere between the Endorphin Pro 4 and the Alpha Fly 3. It's probably kind of the midpoint of that, where I do believe this is going to feel most comfortable to forefoot strikers, but you don't get kind of as much emphasis on the calf and Achilles as I do as when I'm wearing the Alpha Fly 3. And again, it's not quite as smooth for me, or not quite as soft as the Endorphin Pro 4 for me. So it does kind of fit between those two shoes in terms of where it fits. And again, talking about midsole and comparing to kind of the entire field of super shoes, I do feel like this is maybe the firmest option out there. Actually, it might be second to the Float Zig X1 from Reebok. The difference being here though is that Reebok actually doesn't use a super foam or supercritical foam throughout the entirety of the midsole. They have a dual density midsole, which I do think makes it firmer. So in terms of kind of firmness, you probably have 1 and then 2 right there. So if you are someone who likes some extra ground feel in your running, if you are someone who's tired of kind of the overly cushioned feeling underfoot on super shoes, then the Metaspeed Sky Paris could be a really good option for you. Now, final thoughts on the Metaspeed Sky Paris. It's a shoe that I really enjoyed, despite it being a lot firmer than I would maybe prefer for those longer runs, especially the marathon distance. It is a shoe that I would feel confident in though, running a full marathon in, especially with kind of that breathability, but I would probably have to nail the lockdown, maybe double triad runner's knot or some other lacing configuration to make sure that I'm not sliding around in the shoe. But for me, one of the biggest factors in terms of super shoes for marathons are how light is it, as well as how fast does it make me on mile 24, 25 versus mile 1. And I do feel confident that this is a shoe that will propel me forward and is a shoe that isn't going to bog me down with the weight. So there you go. That's the Asics Metaspeed Sky Paris. Now, if you have any questions about the shoe, go ahead and drop them in the comments, and I sure appreciate you sticking around to the end. As always, we're going to leave you with a question, which is, did you try any of the Metaspeed series this year? And if so, did you go with the Edge or the Sky, and why? Thanks, everybody.